Our next guest undertook a study of queer spaces in Halifax during the summer. Part of their work as an undergrad student in the School of Planning at Dal. Sasha Wang is here to tell us about that. Sasha, welcome to Studio A.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeff.
What a great focus.
Yeah.
Yeah. How did you land on this specific area to look at?
Well, personally, I identify as a queer person, so immediately it was something that I was drawn to. I moved here from Surrey, BC back in 2018, and I just saw that there's a difference in queer spaces from here than back at home. So when I was in BC, I wasn't of drinking age, and I found that the queer scene in BC was very focused on the nightlife. So there's the gay village in Vancouver, and I never felt super connected to it because I was such a young person. And when I came here, I just saw queer people being represented all around, more dispersed. So there's spaces like cafes and bookstores, and there's still nightlife here and just like social programs that represents that. And I wanted to learn more about it. And I'm doing a degree in urban planning, and I didn't know if there was an intersection between the two, but in a class called Social Justice with Kate Green, we had a unit about queer spaces and queer planning and gay villages, and that really interested me in the topic. And in the news lately, in the past years, I saw queer spaces closing down all over the world. Yeah. And that made me really sad. I was wondering, why were these spaces closing? There's definitely more queer people. Society has become more accepting, so I wanted to learn about it.
And what did you learn about here in Halifax? And particularly, I'm really interested in what an intersection could be between planning and queer spaces.
Its intersection with urban planning is interesting because what we learn at school is more about gay villages. So these gay villages form as a place of refuge for queer people back in the day. So mostly from the 60s up to the 80s, that was when it was really booming. And they were very focused on community-based, like bottom-up approaches. So by that, what I mean is community members and people that live there and who are queer come together to make spaces for themselves and serve their own community, right? So there's not any usually no support from the government to give funding or any way of giving guidance because they don't feel included in society in general, so they don't interact with the government. But what we see now is that municipalities like HRM are trying to connect more with the community.
Right.
So this could be in any small section of community. In this sense, they want to understand what the queer community needs to help them thrive in the city. So that's what got me into this project. And what I've learned in the summer was that these places are still started by the community. Yes. And what they really need is some support financially and some guidance to help sustain the way they operate. So let's say a place like Glitter Bean Cafe on Spring Garden Road. Yes. It is a queer open space and very focused on queer people. And in the summer and a few months back, they were struggling a bit. They needed funding to help with their operating costs, and just rent was skyrocketing and they needed more help. And they were really connected with their community. So it's great because they got a lot of funding from their people. But I was wondering, how can the government help in this sense, right? How can they help financially? Are there any bursaries or any things that they can apply to?
Some cultural bursaries.
Exactly.
You're talking about now, right?
Yeah. And I was thinking of this concept of heritage planning. So heritage planning is when, typically in HRM, it's when buildings are designated as heritage properties or heritage neighborhoods because they hold a cultural significance or historical significance in the city. So you can see this with Hydrostone. It is very culturally significant as a neighborhood after the Halifax explosion. So it has a very distinct look. It has a distinct story. So that's why there's government support for things like that. So support can look like they help fund your maintenance costs
for of the house,
keeping of the house, buildings, things like that. And I'm wondering if queer spaces that are so iconic to Halifax and so significant to the queer community can be designated as heritage properties.
Now, are you thinking, Sasha, that places that are, for something like say, Glitter Bean, is it something that you're thinking could be applied right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's an ongoing conversation that's happening right now. We're asking ourselves, what is heritage here? What is heritage as a concept? Are we going to only say heritage is things that are a certain age or from a certain perspective, right? What we see as heritage here are mostly European and Western perspectives of buildings and that type of architectural design, and things that are a bit older. But if these places like Glitterbean Cafe or any other queer building is already so significant to the existing community, why can't they live on as living heritage? Why can't they have that title already? And that's a question that we would love to explore. Yeah.
And maybe just give us some of the spaces that you looked at.
Yeah. So I made some brochures, and I made a map, an interactive map, to list out all of the spaces that the people I've interviewed mentioned. And I have some categories. So we can start with shops and cafes. So some nice cafes are like Glitterbean Cafe, and one that surprised me was Annie's Cafe and Catering on Queen Street. So this doesn't scream like a queer space to me, because there's not as many like flashy queer flags or like pride flags, things like that on the outside. But when I was interviewing an Elderberry representative, they said that the owner is such a kind and sweet person and so welcoming, and every time they go there with their friends, they just feel so accepted. And I think that is so important. Like, it doesn't have to be shown aesthetically or physically, but if you just have a relationship with your customers or the people in your community, I think that just speaks way more than anything else. Right. And as for other shops, there's Venus Envy, super iconic in HRM. It's been here since, I think, the 80s.
Yeah, and that should definitely be a heritage space.
Yeah, right? Exactly. They did move locations a couple years ago, but it's
got a history.
It definitely has. And I know that back in the day, there was a bunch of queer spaces on Barrington Street, right? But they all closed down. I think Venus Envy is the only one left there. Surprisingly, Halifax Central Library, because it's a community space and it's well used and it's a pride of Halifax. Yep. But there's a curated selection of LGBTQ content, and also they have in-person events catered to LGBTQ people, like the Youth Drag Show and Drag Story Time. For nightlife, there's Good Robot, which is an iconic place for queer folks, and the local on Godgen, Gus's Pub, Seahorse Tavern. And then what I found surprising in my project was there was a lot for service and care and like social groups, which I really liked. So there's the McPhee Center for Creative Learning, which is a place where youth can use arts to express themselves, and they are very welcome to queer youth. The Youth Project, which is a support group, and it's a charitable organization. They have therapy provided for youth and other social services. There's Rainbow Refugee Association of Nova Scotia. I worked there, and that's why I have a
soft spot
for them. But I did an art night with the community there, and that was really fun. But they're also always getting involved. They empower a lot of people, and they're just always trying to help out folks and bring them into the community. And then I think you mentioned the Queer Spirit Church. That's another one that's really great. And then the Elderberries, there's Intoxicated Queers for queer folks who are getting out of problematic substance use. And there's the AIDS Coalition of Nova Scotia and the Sexual Health Clinic of Halifax, which is really helpful for queer health.
Anything else that you that really struck you while you were doing your research that we haven't covered here?
I think just the history of it all. Just how it started back in the 60s, hearing from Elderberry members how everything was focused on just finding a place of refuge where queer people can exist. And it started off as a place to have bars and nightlife so people can connect in that way. And now there's support for social services, there's health clinics, there's choirs, there's dodgeball, there's all these different things. I think it's just so beautiful. And I just really enjoy Halifax and how it's so different from the other gay places or queer villages around Canada, how it's all dispersed. So I wonder if that means that Halifax is more accepting, and like if queer culture is just integrating it into conventional culture here and like what it means. Yeah.
Sasha, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll talk again.